Analysts about similar stuff this morning, and I'll probably repeat a bit of what I said this morning, but I think it's really, I mean, I think I mean, it's an interesting progression, and I mean, I
Hmm.
can kind of start a little bit of, I mean, I've been working knowledge graphs probably for 7 years, 8 years now. Um, I'd done a ton of metadata management and media management at my previous company, kind of focused on like broadcasters and what metadata they wanted. And then I started to think more about the knowledge embedded in the media, and that was I actually started building a podcast discovery platform, and it's a bit like what Arvid Kahl is doing now with Podscan, if you've seen that, but
Mm.
basically like transcribing, creating a knowledge graph from the podcasts. And it's funny, I like had the idea for that, like a very similar app years ago. But really, I mean, my interest was kind of taking the concept of kind of media management or content management,
Hmm.
using AI to get more out of the data, and then
Hmm.
using a knowledge graph essentially as an index into the data.
Hmm.
And that's where we started like 3.5 years ago, really more as a data cataloging tool for unstructured data. And then flip to pivot to just sell the API as a platform
Hmm.
um, about almost 2 years ago, 18 months ago. And that is really what Graphlit, I mean, became. And so the focus is really about, hey, I mean, we'll manage that whole
Hmm.
pipeline for you. And then RAG became a consumption method on top of the data that we were already collecting. And so that's kind of how we got here.
I love how we've already just jumped in. I haven't even introduced you,
Oh yeah, yeah.
but I think that that's maybe a good way to start. So,
Yeah,
so now that you've given an explanation of how you got into this,
yeah.
why don't you explain who you are?
Who I am. Yeah, so Kirk Marple, founder and CEO of Graphlit. And yeah, I mean, been a career software developer, Microsoft, a bunch of startups, and yeah, that's kind of how I got here.
And I'm Daniel Davis, co-founder of TrustGraph, which is somewhat similar to Graphlit, but not maybe. And that's one of the things I think maybe we're going to talk about is how we're kind of approaching problems maybe from a different
Hmm.
perspective, and uh, maybe we can learn a thing from each other, or maybe not, or maybe we disagree, or maybe we agree on a lot of things. And I think that's
Yeah.
one of the interesting things. Um, so my perspective, I mean, I come at that from a slightly different angle, but and that's one of the things I find so fascinating about, knowledge graphs is, I came from kind of the aerospace world
Mhm.
where I was dealing with mountains of regulations. I was running a safety program one time where you have this 800-page document with all these requirements, and each requirement references other documents.
Mhm.
And sometimes it could be as many as a dozen, 20 other documents, and each one of those documents could be 100 pages, 300
Yeah.
pages. And then they reference documents as well. So when you start looking at the totality of information, it's huge. And what the regulators tend to do is if they are uncertain about what you're doing, or maybe they don't particularly like what you're doing, it gives them ample opportunity to cherry pick from
Mm.
any one of those documents to find a quote or a statement that potentially challenges your approach. And, then of
Mhm.
course, the people that you work for are going to get really, really angry. Why weren't we prepared for that? And you go,
Mhm.
because, you're asking me to know 25,000 pages of documents down to the word level. And that's one of the things I think is, so interesting about this space. And, one of the things that I think we're going to hopefully get into in this
Mhm.
conversation. But one of the first things I want to talk about is the term RAG itself
Yeah.
and kind of where we are with that term now, and kind of our perspective on the future of that term as well.
Now, I think it kind of dovetails into there's this long context window question that people have been, I
Hmm.
mean, like is RAG dead? I think is another way to kind of even look at this. And I mean, the way I look at it, I think is kind of how, I mean, it's biased because of kind of how we came into this of it's first about how do you collect the data? I mean, you need to basically organize the data, focus on ingestion, get the data from the different sources. and then it's really, I mean, I talk a lot about like consumption methods of the data, where it's like, okay, how do you access the data? And that's the R, I mean, in RAG
Hmm.
for retrieval. And I think when people, the counterpoint of a lot of people is like, okay, is that just going to go away? And my opinion, I don't know if you agree with it, is, I mean, to me, it seems like you have to have some retrieval at some point. Like, there's not going to be the ability to just throw everything at an LLM because there's some, even if you just call it a filtering method, you have to get the context of the right data to the LLM. And so I don't think RAG's going away. I think it's, to me, it's just going to become a term like ETL. It's just something that, like, it's just there. Like, it's just part and
Hmm.
parcel of what we're doing in this space. Um, and then I think the GraphRAG, HybridRAG, to me, they're just patterns of, I mean, it's how you implement it, it's how you organize the data, and I don't see them. I think it was initially like this big thing, and everybody was like, okay, I'm doing GraphRAG. Is that a selling point for customers? I kind of see it like it's starting to revert back to these are just flavors. I mean, and everybody can have a mix and a match of different types of RAG. But at the end of the day, it's still getting you a filtered set of information to provide to the LLM.
I do want to come back to this concept in a long context, but I guess the way I look at it is I find it surprising when people even suggest just throwing everything at the LLM for really mundane reasons of cost,
Hmm.
latency, privacy. I mean, I'm sure you've done this because you're one of the few people that seems to do these things like I do.
Hmm.
I've thrown a million tokens or a huge
Hmm.
amount, at Gemini because it has these huge experimental windows, and I've watched it 10 minutes to respond.
Yeah.
You see that it's um, you know, uh, sure, Gemini 1.5 Flash is hyper fast as long as you give it a small amount of context or a reasonable amount of
Hmm.
context. But once you get up to these, hundreds of thousands of tokens, you could be waiting, minutes. And my
Yeah.
understanding is that, OpenAI O1 is, very similar, very long latency on the responses. And then not only talking about the latency of the responses, but just the cost
Yeah.
alone. You're talking every time you type in a question and hit send, that could have cost you $5.
Yeah. Yeah.
With some of these, and that, um, and I think over the last year, most of these, or so many, have been, free or reduced cost.
Hmm.
And, now, we're not seeing that anymore. Even to use the playground with OpenAI, you got to
Yep.
have billing set up because you're consuming tokens, even in the playground. And Anthropic is now doing the same. You're consuming tokens.
Yep. And it's, I mean, even with Haiku 3.5, of them raising the price, which I think
Mm,
is the first time any of the major model providers have raised the price of a model, of an existing model, from between generations. Um, and I mean, I think it's, I mean, my big thing is for the simple case, and this is, I think, where people get stuck is, hey, you're just chatting over a PDF, or you're just uploading a book, or you're uploading a podcast. Like, okay, then shoving it all in the context makes sense. Like, I understand that part of it. There's that messy middle of, like, I mean, is it actually responding to everything in the document or the transcript? I think that's a separate question. But my counterpoint, and I've said this on Twitter before, is like, what if you're over email? What if you're over Slack? What if you're over documents that are changing? Like, you can't you have to have some retrieval mechanism to go back and, like, filter out what is even somewhat relevant. And even if relevance just means the last 30 days of data,
hmm
I mean, that's, I think, the thing that people miss. And maybe they're just trying to be, like, flip about it, of how they talk about it. But I think for me, it's the R is honestly the hard part, of because it's dependent on where you got the data from.
hmm
It's dependent on the indexing, and honestly, you need to make that fast too. And so, I mean, we did see, like, I mean, Pinecone, Qdren, ChromaDB, like, there's been that proliferation of vector DBs and all the different search. And that's, I think, a lot of, you need to have a good stack underneath you to even start playing this game. And that,
hmm
I think, it's starting to stabilize now. But now I think I think you kind of mentioned this, is cost. I mean, we're seeing that, and that one of the downsides of GraphRAG and entity extraction is cost and time. But I mean, it's
Hmm.
we're having customers that are like, hey, okay, I want to do GraphRAG on some data, but not all data, just because it'll cost a couple grand. And that's
Hmm.
a, I mean, it's something that I think is now becoming more of a sticking point with people.
Right. Yeah, I think Claude 3.5 Haiku is a really interesting point because you are right. I guess this is the first time we've seen, a cost increase for a new version of a model, and dramatic too.
Yeah.
Uh, Basically 4x.
Hmm.
And this is like one of the first times I've seen people on Twitter or AI Twitter, maybe AI Twitter is its own universe.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that's true. They were actually talking about, is it worth it? And I thought,
Mhm.
wow, okay, are we now to that point where people are actually
Yeah.
looking at the cost of these things and going, this isn't worth it on a per token cost? And I think it's also really interesting to talk about, Anthropic's thinking behind that. That's even,
Mhm.
I mean, we could have a many hour long discussion on
Yeah.
that one
Yeah.
alone. Is, where do the foundation model providers come up with these prices? Because we have a little bit of a price list in TrustGraph on how we do the cost tracking, which we need to update.
Mhm.
Also, remember, out there, community, we are open source. If somebody wants to go in and update that, please, create a PR. I was surprised that there's no consistency.
Yeah.
Every model provider has a different ratio on input tokens to output
Hmm.
tokens. And, and interestingly, some of the smaller models, the price per input and output tokens are the same. But
Right.
then you see for the big models, there's usually a really big jump for output tokens. And I don't have an explanation for why that is, but um, at the enterprise level, when you're starting talking about large amounts of data and you're having thousands of concurrent users, this stuff adds up really,
Yep.
really quickly. And I am been perpetually shocked we don't see more people talking about it.
Yeah. I think it's also, my guess is it's the kind of demoware versus productionalization.
Hmm.
And I mean, a lot of the conversations I have with the bigger customers that are, I mean, really pushing more data and have bigger visions for us, cost comes into play. I mean, data security is a big one, but cost is really kind of the number up there as the top two of, I think there's, I mean, picking your LLM, I like my pitch to people is, look, I mean, they're going to change. Like, and there's, to your point about the Haiku, there's kind of a tiering I kind of look at. I mean, there's kind of the full models, the GPT-4o, the Sonnet,
Hmm.
and then there's like the mini models. And I think Haiku is a weird one because it's not priced like a mini model, and it used to be. And it's, I think
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that's where now it's like, okay, well, where does that fit? It's not as good as Sonnet, and I actually really like Sonnet 3.5 as kind of a general purpose for images and all kinds of stuff. But now it's like, okay, well, like, why would I even use Haiku? Like, where does that even come into play? Um, and I think that's going to be something where part of it of like, why are they doing this? One of the questions is, I mean, would it be based on volume? Like, why not just make it cheap, make it 4x cheaper, and hope that people use it more, 4x more? And then, but if their margins are not the way, like, is this either they want to prevent people because they don't have enough compute capacity, which is possible, or is it, I mean, do they really think it's that valuable? Like, it's, so I think you're right to question it for sure.
Well, that also brings me up to, boy, we are going down a rabbit hole now. Uh, whatever happened to Opus?
Right.
Because that one, when they launched that, that was eye-watering pricing, very
Yeah.
expensive model. I think it was it was it $75 per million output tokens? I mean,
I
it was
think
pricey.
it's probably still
And
up there. Yeah, but
and I was testing Opus side by side with Sonnet and Haiku, and I went, the Sonnet and Opus responses look identical.
yeah.
And then all of a sudden, Opus just kind of disappears.
Yeah.
They stop talking about it, and the focus is on Sonnet, which kind of leads me to another question, and I don't know the answer to this, and
Mhm.
maybe you've heard some juicy gossip on this or not. What is really the difference
Mhm.
between Opus, Sonnet, and Haiku? Because I can tell you for the knowledge extraction test that we always run, Haiku provided the best results
Interesting.
time and time
Interesting.
again,
Yep.
which I thought was interesting because if you really read Anthropic's um, documentation, they would say things like bigger and most performant, but then the way they describe Haiku is it's like it's the best for specialized tasks.
Mm.
And I'm like, well, what does that really mean? In terms of architecture, are these the same
Mhm.
model architecture? Have they been trained on different data sets? Um, I mean, they're priced very differently, so we we would assume that one is much more efficient to operate than the other,
Mhm.
but perhaps they're not. Um, and then I often think about the um, movie theater popcorn pricing problem
Mhm.
that nobody buys the medium-sized popcorn. It's
Right.
just there
Right.
to give you the illusion of choice because they know you're either going to buy the one that you can barely lug around, the jumbo one,
Yep.
or you're going to buy the super small one. And I think, is that happening with LLM pricing as well? And I don't know. I actually don't have answers to any of these questions. I
Yeah.
can only speculate. Have you heard any good scuttle on these topics?
I mean, the most kind of edgy kind of take I've seen is that, I mean, I have no idea if this is true, of that there was a training failure on Opus, and they kind of had to go back to the drawing board a bit, and that's why it's been shelved. No idea if that's true, but I mean,
Interesting.
that's one thing. But I think, I think parameter size, I mean, that was kind of the classic metric of like, is it a 70
Hmm.
billion?
Hmm.
Is it I mean, 13 or whatever? And I mean, I get it. I mean, that's kind of like, okay, it directly maps to like GPU memory and inference cost and all that kind of stuff. So I think that, I mean, it was the classic way of doing it. And that's where I honestly don't even know like the details of like like why would they be able to release a haiku or a sonnet and not an opus? But to your point of like, if they don't think, part of it I think is dedicating cloud resources. Because I mean,
Hmm.
if you're gonna ship it, you got to dedicate enough. And I think maybe they're just keeping those eggs in a different bucket, is my theory. That they're like, okay, we're just gonna keep those resources to run Sonnet and Haiku. If they don't think Opus is that much better, then it's probably just worth keeping it off the shelf for now. And I mean, it's kind of like the blowback on the new iPhone is like, I mean, why would anybody upgrade if it's literally the same phone? And maybe that's what they're seeing is like if it's starting to be kind of this curve of they're not seeing the benefit of these bigger models, um, and maybe that's starting to have a bit of a pushback on this kind of three-tier approach of and maybe I mean honestly maybe it's like GPT is GPT-4o, GPT-4o mini, so you have only the small and the big popcorn, and Anthropic tried to do small, medium, big, and so maybe there's this regression
Hmm.
back to like a two-tier approach, and maybe Sonnet becomes the GPT-4o, it's the top, um, and then you get the O1, which is like a different flavor of models, and maybe Anthropic's going to sort of superset Opus with something like that. Who knows?
Interesting. Oh wow, we could spend so much time talking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
this, and it's fun. But you touched on a topic I think is really interesting. Is my background in running very complex programs with very long life cycles is you think about what's known as a technology readiness
yep.
scale. You think about where you are in that maturity scale. And another way to think about it is maybe if you think about the 80/20 principle, like where are we on that scale? And I kind of think in terms of LLMs, or maybe we should separate this. Let's say I'm gonna limit it to just the transformer architecture.
Mhm.
Where do you think we are on that maturity curve?
It's an interesting question, and I come at it from a different place where I'm not an ML engineer. I was never a data
Hmm.
scientist. I've been more a distributed systems guy, application developer, that kind of thing. So I'm coming at LLMs as it's an API. Like it's I'm
Hmm.
and I think it's there's a lot of these projects, these RAG projects came from, I mean, like LangChain, LlamaIndex, these guys were all ML engineers coming kind of up from that level. I look at it as I just want the best thing that is that I
Hmm.
can consume, and I know I'm going to swap it out later. And so I mean, we kind of come at it more in an agnostic manner. And so
Hmm.
I think my take is there was a quick curve up, like
Hmm.
you saw a really fast progression over the last 18 months. Um, and then, I mean, it definitely seems to be sort of slowing down a bit as these companies learn how to pay for them. I mean, what's good, what's bad. Um, I I don't anticipate any major step changes. Like people talk about GPT-5 and that kind of stuff, and my gut says I mean, it's going to be more of a slower progression. And at some point, we're going to commoditize on something that maybe is so good that nobody cares. I don't think that's going to happen for a number of years. But like the whole AGI thing, I think for us, I mean, we've been in the mix of this, like in the deep weeds with these LMs for a while. Like they are not that smart. Like, I mean, to me, I just don't think, I think there's so much farther that they can go. But
Hmm.
it feels like things are slowing down a little bit in terms of each like increment. And so I really wonder what is the ceiling? Like, do we need to, I mean, like you said, transformer architecture, like, do we need to have some step change of a different architecture? So there's kind of that Moore's law kind of like thought
Hmm.
process there, but I'm not expecting to be surprised by anything in 2025, but I could be completely wrong.
Boy, I wish, I wish you were saying stuff that I didn't agree with mostly.
Yeah.
B- because I very much feel the same way. I think that if you look at it more like a 80-20 rule, Pareto kind of principle philosophy, I think that with like GPT-4, um, we probably hit kind of like that 80%.
Mhm.
And we're now where it's really leveling off, and big, any incremental improvements are really hard to come by. And I think
Mhm.
that's why we're seeing the velocity of new models being released is slowed down.
Mhm.
um, Also probably because of GPU and compute availability.
Yeah.
uh, you know uh, and I think that we are seeing that, as you said, there's not going to be like any really big surprises or shocks probably coming. We've hit that a level of maturity that I think is quite high, and now we're eking out those last few percentage points. And this is kind of the commercial aerospace industry has been in this mindset for a very, very long time. If you look at
Mhm.
the airplanes we fly on today,
Yeah.
they are very, very similar to those from
Mhm.
30 and 40 years ago. It's
Yep.
just they're making them just slightly more efficient. Like we're talking tenths of a percentage point of
Mhm.
efficiency. And there's not been any real big innovation in commercial aerospace for decades.
Mhm.
However, I'm proud of myself for not immediately jumping in and interrupting you. You said a trigger word for me. You said AGI.
Yeah.
I have very, very strong opinions about that term. What does that term mean to you?
It is such an overused term. I'm not a fan of it. I mean, I think it's kind of a hype term, but I think as a data point of like at least where I feel the consent, I mean, there's some like you said, 80-20 rule of where that's heading. It's kind of like self-driving AI. Like, I mean, when some like reasoning engine that is available via some API that you can give it something human like a plan of attack that it can achieve on its own. Like it is that agents, is that like, I mean, how is it gonna like reason about it and correct itself and all that kind of stuff and give you a response that seems I mean, human replaceable in a way. I think, I mean, that's kind of where my mental picture of it is, but I still think it's like a fake term in a lot of ways. It's just whatever people want it to be. Um, but I mean, I look at like, I mean, you probably have this with the amount of prompting and guidance that you have to give to the LMs to get the output you want. I would assume AGI means you don't have to do that. like that it should just figure it out,
Hmm.
like for the most part, like I mean, I shouldn't have to be so specific to get it to correct itself or to not do something. Like that's where I have, I mean, with like even our entity extraction prompts are very specific. I mean, in a lot of ways, and we're like, okay, don't like, I mean, make sure you quote JSON strings and all that kind of
Hmm.
the hints you have to give it. Like, I would assume that a model that is more human-like would just never do that. Like, it should already have the knowledge how to do those kind of things. And so I mean, I think maybe that's correctable at some point, but I think it's also, I don't feel we're anywhere close to, I mean, to like a sort of autonomous world of, hey, you just give it an instruction and it, I mean, even if you're a little bit off in your instruction, it just figures it out from the context and keeps from there. I think you still have to be pretty damn prescriptive of what you're trying to achieve.
You put me at a crossroads. I'm thinking I can either steer this conversation back to talking about knowledge graphs, or we can
Yeah,
continue talking down this other path. I think what I'm going to do, we're going to circle back to that other path
yeah,
because now you've gotten me wanting to talk about knowledge graphs and entity extraction and a lot of the things that we spend a
yeah.
lot of time on, a lot of time. And one of the things that we found is well, I guess one of the things that we found last year is we felt that models being able to extract to a JSON schema, that was like, oh my God, I can't believe we could,
Yeah.
wow, we can do that. And now that's relatively trivial. Most
Hmm.
models are using an actual JSON schema style structure that you can specify a response schema, and it's extremely reliable. Last year we were having to manually input in multiple examples of the schema,
Hmm.
and some models would do okay and some models would not. But one of the things that we find is uh, what what models think an entity is.
Mm.
Uh, I've gotten to the point where I tend to specify entities as like people, places, things,
Hmm.
locations, events, and then I ask for topics separately as being,
Mm.
conceptual concepts. And what I find is that most models, even with that paradigm, will return the same list.
Mm.
That even when specifying, I want you to think about these two tasks differently, you still get the same output. Now, of course, maybe that depends on the input source.
Hmm.
Again, this stuff is so time consuming to test and manually human evaluate. It's challenging. I was curious, how have you seen similar behavior?
Hmm.
And have you seen any potential techniques of managing that, or what are these magic words that really get the full breadth of
Hmm.
all the things we want to get out of a text corpus or any sort
Yeah.
of source?
And I think, I mean, and we've talked about this a little offline, is, I mean, we take a bit of a different approach where we're opinionated about the entities, and we'd even done this before LLMs. It's schema.org, JSON
Hmm.
LD. So we're opinionated. We actually, like in our JSON document structure that we store in the database, we store a blob of JSON LD. And so, I mean, that is like our canonical format for all of our
Hmm.
entities. Um, and so, I mean, that's one of the reasons that when I did my original testing, and this was probably like, yeah, like a year or two ago, of how well do the models know what schema.org is or JSON-LD is and all these entity
Hmm.
types. And I mean, I found like, I mean, exceedingly well with the early GPT-4, GPT-4 Turbo that they could reliably extract as JSON-LD. And so that was
Hmm.
kind of the starting point. And it mapped well to what the structure we already had. So I mean, we basically prompt and ask it to give us an array essentially of JSON LD back. And so the LLM has to do its own data mapping to the properties that it knows about in the JSON the schema.org taxonomy. And so we're label like topics or what we call labels, like we do kind of carve those out as a separate, I mean, say, okay, anything else that doesn't fit these entities, treat as a label. And, um, but it's, I mean, for anything it can, the good thing about schema.org and that all that, it can pull from different areas of the document and say like, okay, a company if the address is a couple paragraphs down and maybe like, I mean, if it knows that that's the address for Microsoft, it'll put that into the entity. And with the NER approach we used to do with just Azure Text Analytics, it was good at term recognition, but it would not pull together from different pieces. It was very
Mm.
small window of what it would analyze as it went through the text. And that's been the big benefit for us is it's able to canonicalize things. Like if it says MSFT, it knows that's really Microsoft or
Hmm.
whatever. Um, but that so I mean I don't know if our I mean technique is unique, but we are very opinionated about that, and that's just I mean the way we work.
Well, no, I think I'm not aware of anybody else using the JSON, I mean, using schema.org for their ontology. I mean, ontologies are, people are very opinionated about those.
Mhm.
They tend to be. Um, Most people are not even aware about ontologies like schema.org or
Yep.
OWL or some of the other ones. Um, so that's an interesting approach. Um, we kind of are ontology less. We're trying to
Mhm.
do a custom extraction, and we were experimenting with ways to build kind of a custom ontology for each data set. We don't really do that right now. That's kind of one of those things that's on the back burner of things to come back to. It's because it does
Mhm.
add a little bit of complexity. But that does lead me to talking about formats.
Mhm.
And I have to be careful because I might get myself in trouble with the Cypher community, or maybe I'll just do it anyway. We see, interestingly, the AI space has mostly coalesced around Cypher-based knowledge graphs.
Mhm.
And I don't necessarily have a really high reliability answer as to why, um, despite the fact that RDF kind of was the standard for such a long time. I understand why people look at RDF and go, "Ooh," um, and I can understand why they would say, like, "Why do you need all these linkages? Why are these namespaces these ways?" Um, but then, I look at Cypher and I go, well, the Cypher as a structure isn't so bad. But when you look at the Cypher queries, I just go like,
Right.
"Ugh, what?" Um, so you are you predominantly using JSON LD in most all your data structures, and then asking, so what are your opinions
Yeah.
on knowledge graph formats, and do you think we're going to continue to coalesce around this movement towards open Cypher, where RDF make a comeback, or is somebody going to develop something else?
It's interesting, I mean, because I got started on this early, and so we actually use Gremlin because we're based on Cosmos DB, their graph database, um, and for me, it's not such a big deal because at the end of the day, it's like, okay, if you're going to use the MongoDB query language or direct SQL, the blast radius of that of like changing one to the other isn't that big. And so for us, it's like, okay, we could use Cypher if we were using Neo4j or we were using somebody else. The query isn't the complex part. It's really about, okay, how do you get the data in there in the first place? What is queryable? Like what indexes do you have? What edges do you have? Like that kind of stuff. Um, and so for us, I mean, I think we look at it a little differently where like a lot of the examples I see for GraphRAG and thing, it's like, oh, you're generating Cypher at like using the LLM to generate Cypher. We don't do that at all. Like we just use normal code. Like for the query engine, what we're generating is first the entity relationships, and then we're just essentially figuring out what the IDs are for those entities, and then we're querying that through the graph. And so I think we're taking a bit of a different approach where much more object oriented maybe or entity
Mhm.
oriented. Um, and so, I mean, and this may just be my sort of naive approach originally from coming up with this, that is just very different, I think, from at least a lot of the examples I've seen out there. And so, I mean, we're building a graph dynamically, but at the
Mhm.
end of the day, the talking to the database part is like the simple part. It's really about the composing what the entities and nodes and edges are that is the more the complex part. And then dealing with things like deduplication and entity resolution and all that kind of stuff, which I mean, we honestly have a ways to go. Like, there's a lot more we could do with entity resolution, but I think that's a whole other topic.
Oh, absolutely. But what's interesting is you finally said something that is typically the opposite of what I say. I tend to say getting knowledge into the graph is easy. It's getting it out that's the hard part.
Oh,
But I
interesting.
think this, but I think this is because we have a different way of doing it. Is because you're a very entity oriented approach, so that you know what entities you're looking for,
Right.
and whereas we're trying to take what we were calling a naive extraction, a naive approach, where we don't know anything about what you're giving to me. It's like giving a blind person objects, and tell me what it is.
Right. Right.
And in that scenario, uh, querying the graph is actually quite a bit more challenging, and that's actually why we use the vector
Makes sense.
databases as a creating those mapped vector embeddings as a helper
Hmm.
to say, when somebody makes a request, like, what are we looking for? Which that approach is one of the things we're finding on really large data sets, is that it makes the guardrailing, for lack of a better word, like very tight.
Mm.
So when compared to other kind of similar approaches, TrustGraph will very quickly go like, I don't know, you didn't give me any information that tells me, even though it's kind of there. So our approach right now is actually quite conservative on the extract
Mm.
on the querying side. So we're having to experiment with how to adjust those parameters to get
Hmm.
more or less, or what ends to get the kind of responses we want. So we're kind of having like the opposite problem of a lot of others now. It's not hallucinating. It's just so conservative, won't say anything at all.
Hmm.
But you did touch on another point that I think is really interesting, is that I see so many new graph databases, graph stores, vector databases, these hybrid stores that are doing things in their own format, that have lots and lots of integrations. And I keep asking myself, why are so many people building new graph databases?
Yeah. I mean, I think separating the vector and the graph database, sort of part of that question is interesting because, I mean, really I mean, Pinecone was kind of the initial kind of like they really stuck their neck out initially and said, "Hey, this is going to be a thing," before
Hmm.
the real wave happened. So you got to give them credit for like seeing that wave of like essentially productionalizing FICE and the kind of vector things that had been out there before. And then there was a lot of, I mean, not to deprecate them, but I mean copycats. I mean, people basically offering maybe like a cheaper, faster version of that, and then there's the ones that are like, okay, do you want cloud hosted? Do you want local? So you get the Chroma DB and you get things like that. And they're all, I mean, all of them work really well. And I think they're canonicalized or sort of, what do you want to say, commercializing a lot that, I mean, they're all pretty much the same offering. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just kind of the feature sets are starting to regress to a common set. So, but then on the graph database side, I mean, graph's been around forever. I mean, Neo4j has been
Hmm.
around, what? I mean, 15 years or more. I don't even know how long they've been around. And I mean, some of these like very RDF specific solutions, like they were very, I mean, these companies that were doing graphs for years before LLMs. I think so now there's a circle back, which is a very different thing than the vector side of like Neo4j just had like they're probably the happiest because now they have another use for their technology. And so all this stuff just builds and it's another reason to um, sell their technology, which is great for them. And but I think I mean, it's a different thing where now, I mean, for us, we look at it as a hybrid. I mean, we actually use a graph database, a vector database, and a JSON document store. And I mean, the graph is more of a light for us. It's more of a lightweight index. Like, I mean, we're using the graph to get IDs to look up from the
Hmm.
JSON document store. Similar
Hmm.
with the vector database. Like when we do a similarity search, essentially we're just returning IDs. We're not returning all the data, and then we're just looking up from Cosmos because Cosmos is super quick. Like it's I mean like 5 milliseconds to like load JSON. I
Hmm.
mean
Hmm.
so it's that doesn't become a performance bottleneck, but it also lets us not have to keep a ton of data synchronized between the different databases. You're really just keeping like they're already sort of joined by ID across the databases. But for us, I mean, that's just kind of what I came up with like 5 or 6 years ago,
Hmm.
and it works and it seems like it's effective, but there's a lot of other ways to tackle this. So.
Yeah, certainly Neo4j has, and kudos for them for seeing this as a big opportunity. They have
Yep.
really pushed all in on the AI space. I think most AI developers think, Neo4j is now synonymous with knowledge graph. So,
Yeah.
full marks to Neo4j for seeing the opportunity. But I guess the question I'm really curious about is what motivates somebody to say, with so many knowledge graphs out there, like,
Mhm.
oh, I can build a better one. I'm trying to understand like what it is that people are doing differently with these graph databases, and like what is it they think is so wrong with all the options
Right.
out there today, and where they think they're going with that. Because again, we're trying to uh, we don't want to build our own graph
Mhm.
database. That's not what we're trying to do.
Yep.
We want to use the best ones that are provide the best performance. And I'm um, just kind of befuddled by how many options there are. And people keep saying, have you tried out this graph data, this new one? Have you tried out this one? I'm thinking, why are there so many new ones popping up every day?
I think, I mean, yeah, it's a really good question. I think part of it is I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire. Like you get, maybe it's a VC investment thing where, I mean,
Mm,
somebody comes up and they're like, I could do that better. And hey, okay, the market's growing. I mean, and people think, okay, I'm gonna invest. Like there were so many investments in the vector database world, what, last year, 18 months ago, and it just was like this pile of money. And I think we're now seeing that, like, you get a hot spot where, I mean, people see that there's I mean, maybe a market, but the differentiation becomes hard. I mean, like really at the end of the day, like cost, performance, like is there really a big feature difference between any of these? I mean, not as much. I don't think so. I mean,
hmm
I think capability wise, you could pretty much implement what you or I are doing on any of these graph
hmm
databases. And I think for us, our our sort of reasoning was, I mean, my reasoning for architecting this way was really, I mean, managed services. Like I mean, for us, we wanted to be a fully managed service. So be able to have scale from day one, data distribution, like replication across regions, like Cosmos DB gave us that. And so there was a benefit there of sitting on top of the shoulders of something like that and
hmm
not having to deal with, okay, we got to deploy the graph database to Kubernetes and think about data backup. And we just got that out of the box. And so I think there's a lot of database companies now rebuilding all those features, and you kind of now, I mean, how lightweight, how enterprise ready, I think starts to become one of the big differences.
I also wonder, I see a lot of what I call reinventing the wheel lately.
Yep,
And I wonder how much of this are people just aren't aware that there's already so many solutions out there.
100%. I mean, I mean, I could go off for a half an hour just about RAG with that. I mean, I'm sure you see on Reddit every day, people are like, hey, I want to build X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, you don't need to build this from scratch. Like you
Yeah.
don't need LangChain. You don't need this or that. Like it just, I mean, we are a RAG as a service company. You could use us and be up and running in 5 minutes. And then when you try and market around that, is people are like, oh no, don't promote yourself. But you're trying to save people time. And that's really the thing of, I think these days we're still kind of competing against do it yourself mode where people just they want to build it themselves because they want to take the time and maybe learn. But when you get into production, there's a lot of services that, I mean, can actually help you and save time. And then I think I expect 2025 to kind of be the as a service year for this stuff where
Mm.
I mean, that's I don't know if that's a hot take, but I see that, I mean, there's a lot more companies popping up that are calling themselves RAG as a service. I think, I mean, GraphRAG as a service, and I think we'll start to see people now expecting to go that direction, not to like, hey, I got to cobble together 5 different things to build that.
No, the hot take was you said you don't need a LangChain. I'm totally clipping that, and I'm going to make you go viral for saying that. Sorry,
I don't.
Harrison.
I don't think that's unique. I think there's still.
Oh, I
I
got to
think
clip
it's.
that. All this
Yeah.
content. Keep going. Don't stop.
No, go for it.
Oh no, I don't know. I'm just my mind is now racing with things I probably shouldn't say. Um, well, actually, I mean, oh boy, we could get derailed with that so quickly. I mean, that's a question I ask myself though, is the Boy. So personally, I'm a big fan of the concept of appearance versus reality as we see it
Hmm.
all throughout life. And, not just using LangChain as an example, because LangChain is
Sure.
extremely popular and, it's an easy target because everybody knows it. And, but there's a lot of things it does and a lot of things it doesn't do. And yet, when people start trying to build an AI, it's almost like, well, you have to use LangChain to do this.
Mm.
And one of the things that I really grapple with and try to understand is how to get TrustGraph in front of people so that they even know, like, no, like as you're saying, you don't have to rebuild this RAG pipeline. You could use Graphlit, you could use TrustGraph. There's lots of alternatives out here that potentially have already built what you've done and have been doing it for quite a long time,
Yeah.
put a lot of effort into this. And there's this big disconnect between how do you get people aware of these solutions, whereas LangChain have done an extremely good job of making themselves aware to everybody in the AI space
Hmm.
that the LangChain is ubiquitous to everybody
Hmm.
building an AI. Everybody knows it. I think Llama Index is pretty close
Hmm.
behind, and is it just the benefit of timing that they were early and as the AI trend was accelerating, they were got kind of attached to it. But now here we are today, closing on the end of 2024, and they're still so tightly coupled with it. How do new and emerging solutions really get their name in those
Hmm.
conversations so that you don't see people on
Yeah.
Reddit posting like, well, I'm trying to do this with LangChain and not aware that there's 20 different solutions that
Yeah.
already do this.
And I mean, I give them I mean, I really give LangChain a lot of credit. I mean, I mean, I I think timing had a ton to do with it, probably a lot of luck. It just was the right thing at the right time, and he took a lot of arrows in his back from being early and kind of but he made a market out of it. I mean, and now made
Hmm.
something. I mean, you're kind of seeing that a little bit with Crew AI and AI agents, and I mean, hype matters. I mean, if you can create a community around yourself and then start to figure out how to monetize it, I mean, that's a good thing. And so I think but then on the other hand is, I mean, they've also taken a lot of crap from maybe the quality originally or the documentation, but they've had this community stick with them as they iterate, which is super important. So they created a sticky product, which you got to give them kudos for. Now, do I think anybody needs them? Like, if you're just looking for a RAG pipeline to solve the 80% of problems, I don't think so. Like, I think there's enough commoditization over what is a RAG pipeline and the data ingestion stack and all that kind of stuff that I think you can pretty much put a pin in that whole thing and offer it as a service. I really do. And I mean, the questions like if you can support every model that comes out, if you can, I mean, like the biggest difference I see today is does somebody want to self-host it or do they want a cloud service? I mean, and that's like, and we've basically decided to say, look, we're just a cloud service. Like we're not going down that road, which leaves us out of some conversations, but it also
Hmm.
lets us optimize for the other
Hmm.
conversation. And so I think you start to see this bifurcation on different angles, kind of that from where we were a year ago, in terms of why you pick one thing or another. But also you see that, I mean, the LangChain's now LangGraph they're focused on observability, I mean, agents. I think it's because LangChain itself is commoditized a ton. And I
Hmm.
mean, even with like the new Vercel AI SDK is pretty sweet. Or, I mean, using light LLM to get abstraction.
Hmm.
I mean, there's new things that people now are starting to become a de facto standard.
One of the interesting things I think about LangChain is they're a bit of a kingmaker in the space at the moment. If they promote your project, you can immediately see the GitHub stars come rolling in,
Yep.
which shows you, how much persuasion power they have in this space. Talking about timing, though, that brings us to something I want to talk about, and you already kind of alluded to this. Where do we think this is going? Where do we think the
Yeah.
space is going? AI in general, RAG, whatever we want to call RAG, knowledge
Mhm.
graphs. So where do you think if we do this again this time next year, where do you think we're going to
Mhm.
be?
I mean, I really think the as a service is going to get a lot bigger. Like, I mean, it's people are going to start going to a service first, an API first approach before thinking about just cobbling together some like Python code to make a demo. And I think the consider it like the bar is moving up. I mean, like you look at like what Firecrawl is doing with web scraping, or I mean, some of these companies are now doing as a service. I think I think that's going to start to become more commonplace for more solution-oriented functionality. Um, I mean, the agent tools. I mean, my prediction is there's so many agent frameworks popping up, and I have my own skepticism about that. But I think that what you would call like a tool to be called by an agent, I think we're going to see more and more of those. And so it's more like these little solution widgets that can do something that is callable from an LLM. I think we're gonna see that grow. Um, I have no idea if 10 years and beyond. Honestly, I mean, it changes so fast. I'll punt on those. I think 5 years, the only thing I'll say is, I mean, I worked at General Motors right after they bought Cruise, and there was so much hype of like, okay, we're gonna have self-driving in like 18 months, or we're gonna be doing this, this, this. And I was pretty skeptical at the time, where I was like, it's not gonna move that fast. Like, I think I tend to think things will still happen. They just won't move at the pace that the hype suggests they happen.
Mm.
So if we look at what AGI or whatever you want to call like the next wave of I look at it more on a 5 year window than a 1 year window. I assume that we'll get there, but not at the curve that a lot of the hype, I mean, maybe suggests it will. That's my take.
Boy, we're going to have another offline conversation because I don't know if you know, I was actually at Lyft's autonomous division L5,
Oh yeah,
and I am very aware of GM's acquisition of Cruise and how that was all related to actually Lyft even still existing today, which is
yeah,
a very interesting story that most people don't realize that Lyft came within real close of bankruptcy, and
yeah,
that the GM deal kind of saved it. But then the GM deal didn't work the way that they had planned it to,
yeah,
and things
yeah,
went in different directions. It was all, I mean, it was even confusing to us. Like I probably have more questions and answers than most people from outsiders. So I guess 2 points. I'm going to, since you punted, I'll do a little bit more long-term thinking. I think that AI and RAG and all of this is going to coalesce into actually, I'm not as pessimistic as some people are about replacing jobs. And I know that
mhm,
I've heard a lot of questions about personnel as being a lot of enterprises a barrier to adoption for AI. And I think it's actually, and again, the AV industry is a great example of this. One of the biggest barriers to innovation in that space are the regulations,
mhm,
because you're trying to understand, how do we prove that this system is safe? How do we prove it's secure? We have this incredibly complex systems, and all this stuff has to work together, and you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation, and you typically have a very small team of people trying to manage all that
mhm,
with risk and compliance. And I think it's exactly those kinds of domains that are going to rapidly accelerate now with tools where
mhm.
you can kind of connect all those data silos now with AI, and being able to
Yeah,
have that insight and bring that into a knowledge graph and map all that out and create those
mhm,
indexes, and being able to very quickly see how all these things are related to each other, as opposed to somebody having multiple screens and
yep,
having one PDF here and one PDF here, and you're scrolling between them and copying and pasting, because that's exactly what I used to do. And honestly, that's still what people are doing
yeah,
today if you're not using AI to do this. It's very manual, and you're talking about relying on somebody to look at thousands upon thousands and thousands of pages of documents and not miss one word, which,
yep.
surprise surprise, they do. And that brings me back to the final question I want to ask. And this is one that I sometimes even I try to avoid conflict on Twitter as much as I can, but this one I have a hard time avoiding. I see people talking a lot now about type one and type two thinking, and I'm a big fan of the work that people like Kahneman and Pinker have done in behavioral economics over the last 70 years. And I find that so many people building an AI seem to think these are new concepts,
Mm.
that behavioral economics hasn't studied this for 70 years, that we haven't studied how humans make decisions, and it's extremely well modeled. And I I think to myself, I see so many people in the AI space trying to model the technology after humans. And I
Mm.
think we're so well aware at how bad we are at making decisions. And we are. I will
Yeah.
die on that hill. I will absolutely die on it, but I won't die on it because I'm right. Uh, why are we trying to model this technology after ourselves? Should we model ourselves? Should we model the technology after ourselves? And if not, what should we model it after?
That's a great question. I mean, I think to me, this kind of reminds me of this whole agent kind of thing of like, I mean, a lot of these agents are modeled after groups of people doing things. Like it's very anthropomorphic in a lot of ways where it's like, hey, I'm a person that does this task and here's the output of the task. And I think that, I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, I mean, they're, to me, they're kind of like, it's just Lego parts. I mean, you're like, I'm more doing a task, inputs, outputs, and I'm going to connect these up, but it doesn't have to be anthropomorphized in that way. And maybe it's because we think the LLMs like it. I mean, to be talked to that way, like as a like editor, like you're a very smart editor, like blah blah blah, and like I think it's maybe that's just the way they're trained. So people have kind of evolved from that. Um, but I think it's, I mean, to me, and I mean, I even just saw something the other day about data contracts between agents, and I was like, isn't
Hmm.
this just like SOAP or Corba from 20 years ago, of just like negotiating data contracts? And to me, being old enough that I've seen this wave a couple times, I feel that there's a not invented here syndrome that's happening. And kind of to your point of, I mean, people reinventing the wheel. I mean, there's so much that we've already thought through, of different generations have thought through in different situations, that I think is being ignored, and people are just wasting a lot of time. I mean, reinventing the wheel. So I completely agree on that. And a lot of what's happening in agents right now, not just AI, I mean, is just replicating distributed computing. Like it has nothing to do with AI. It's just, hey, how do I get a process to communicate with another process and have a data contract between them? Like we were doing this 20 years ago, like 25 years ago. So I think I think AI needs to like bubble up a little bit, like the AI community maybe of, I mean, hey, why don't we just pick and choose the right pieces and not call it something new? And so that's kind of maybe I mean, my take. I completely agree where there's way too much of this not invented here, kind of like let's try and be unique, but we're just there's nothing unique in some of these spaces. So.
What is old will become new again.
I mean, I think it's also, I mean, it sounds reverse ageist or something. I mean, it's a younger generation like that is of developers. They just don't have the history there. I mean, I was at Microsoft in the late 90s and like, I mean, COM and I mean, SOAP and all these things were like, I mean, if people knew about them, they would just have a different vision of what they're doing now. But nobody thinks about those. Like you don't see it discussed anywhere. And I think that is somewhat indicative of the tech community right now, where there's a very small window of learning that they're not looking back. I feel like, I mean, 20 years ago, we were kind of maybe had a wider view of what tech was existing and what we were going to plan to do next. I think that it feels like it's become a bit more myopic.
Well, that's why I also say that some of the best papers I've ever read on AI were from the DARPA MUC or MUC conferences
Hmm.
from the mid to late 90s.
Yeah,
They are very hard to find. And those conferences were annual until I think the seventh one, which then they stopped, which was odd because if you read the papers from the seventh one, all of a sudden people reporting really promising findings,
yeah.
actually doing the exact stuff we're talking about now, entity extraction from text corpuses.
Hmm.
And it was really astonishing the stuff that all these people were working on. And again, yeah, to your point, that was in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Like these
I,
papers were much higher quality than most of the papers I see out there today.
Well, I mean, hell, like, I mean, I literally had an AI class in my senior year of college of undergrad, and I mean, that was a hell of a long time ago. And I mean, but we were like implementing expert systems and doing this kind of stuff. And I mean, I remember from one of my first jobs going to an AI conference in Boston, and I mean, that was before the AI winter and before all this. I mean, this stuff, but they were still business people trying to solve things.
Yeah.
And I mean, probably a lot of the same similar problems were trying to be solved, and the tech just wasn't there. I mean, the compute wasn't there. And so I think now it's all come around with GPUs and machine learning, and the capabilities are so much better that we can achieve a lot more things. But I wish people would kind of look back a little more to be like, hey, like we don't have to tread those same paths again.
I think the conclusion is we're on the verge of yelling at kids to get off our lawns.
Yeah, I know. I try not to say those things. So no, but it's I mean, it's definitely something where I just don't want to waste time. Like, and for me, it's about being efficient, and that's the only time I look at it and I'm like, come on, we don't have to rebuild these things again. Like, you don't have to. I mean, it's a refactoring problem to me in a lot of ways, where I'm like, okay, let's just do those things once, build on top of those layers, and we can all move faster.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to have this chat with me today, Kirk.
Yeah,
I think
same here.
in the interest of efficiency, we need to get back and get building so that we don't have to yell at these kids to get off our lawn. We can actually show them that we learned a thing or two and might actually have a
Exactly.
few tricks up our sleeves still.
I know
And
there's probably been a model released while we were recording this, so we
oh,
probably have
I'm
to go
sure.
check.
There's no telling what we've missed. Well, I mean, given what today is, there's no telling what we missed on Twitter right
Yeah.
now or Reddit. And so I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been great. I always enjoy talking with you. Always interested to see what you're doing at Graphlit, and hopefully we can do this again really soon.
Yeah, same here. This is a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.